So, hi, welcome everyone. I can already see some people are joining very much on time, sharp at 4 p.m. That's very nice to see. I would say we will still wait a bit for more people to join. But in the meantime, like in the first 1 or 2 minutes, I think it would be great if you can maybe post in the chat, just type in the chat, where you're joining from today and in what kind of role and sector you work in. It's very interesting to know what kind of people are joining, like who's in the virtual room with us today, so we know what the audience looks like. Oh, USA, Kansas. Well, that is a bit of a different time zone. I'm glad you could still make it. It's a bit earlier in the morning for you, and for us, it's like a nice end of the workday. But I would say let's get started. Let's dive in, and yeah. So thank you all very much for being here. My name is Paulina Roßnagel, and I'm a senior researcher for impact analysis and a scope 3 expert at the WifOR Institute. And today I will be your moderator for the masterclass. So before we start, let me quickly summarize what today's masterclass is about. So across the pharmaceutical value chain, scope 3 emissions remain one of the most important, but also challenging sustainability topics. And unlike operational emissions, scope 3 emissions arise outside of a company's direct control. That means that progress can hardly be achieved by one company only. So what scope 3 emissions really illustrate is that there is some kind of need for a shared data foundation and for joint action across the value chain. And at the same time, many organizations, probably also many of you, are asking yourself similar questions like, if I have a first assessment of my scope 3 emissions, how do I translate it into practical action? How do we prioritize where to engage suppliers and which suppliers? And what can we achieve by ourselves? And where is collaboration essential? So the goal of today is to explore how companies, in this case in the pharmaceutical value chain, can move from scope 3 challenges to joint actions. And we're going to do this in 3 parts today. First, I will start with a keynote on like typical scope 3 patterns in the pharmaceutical industry, including some benchmarks and hotspots, and also where collaboration becomes especially important. Then we will hear it directly from 2 practitioners from Takeda and Evonik, who will share experiences from both the manufacturers, but also the supplier's perspective. And then finally, we'll open the discussion for your questions in the form of a live Q&A. So we also planned some times for 2 quick polls during the session to make it a bit more interactive, and we can also then better understand where your priorities lie and what your perspective is like. So before we dive in, let's quickly have our speakers introduce themselves. So maybe Jessica, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Paulina. Hi, everyone. Jessica Vieira. I'm head of environmental sustainability operations and business excellence at Takeda. I'd like to thank WifOR for hosting this very interesting event, and I'm excited to kind of see other ideas in the chat as we go through. I'm also very happy to be, sharing thoughts alongside Evonik and Ranjan, who's here. Evonik is a very long-standing and strong partner of Takeda's to support our business, but very importantly today, a like-minded and equally as ambitious, I would say, partner when it comes to sustainability and the decarbonization strategy. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I also want to acknowledge, several team members at Takeda who have joined. Thank you for all the work that goes on in the background. So we have something, good to talk about here today in terms of our scope 3 journey. So our procurement and other stakeholders. Ranjan, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, my name is Ranjan Fletcher. I'm manager of sustainability development in the business line healthcare at Evonik. And yeah, it's a great platform here to be with WifOR, who are an independent partner here and our customer Takeda. And I'm really looking forward to how we can go on this little journey to talk about what we can do to work together. So yes, I'm looking forward to this. Thank you. hand back to you, Paulina.
Thank you very much. Thank you for both of you. So now, before we jump into the keynote, I would like to start with a quick poll. So you can either scan the QR code with your phone, or there should be a link in the chat that will also lead you to the web page. So my question for you would be, what is your biggest challenge when working with scope 3 emissions currently? You find a list of possible responses, but you can also type in your own opinion if that doesn't fit you. So please take a few seconds to respond, because seeing this and seeing the results will then also later on help us tailor the discussion maybe a bit and pick up some of your priorities during the sessions. Okay. Okay, it's still exciting to see which one is going to win, but it looks like we have a winner of like what is the biggest challenge. You can still vote, but I will already comment on it. So thank you very much for the responses. It's very interesting to see the distribution, but what I can clearly see is that limited supplier data is a very common challenge, in this case also especially among the pharmaceutical supply chains. And we will come back to this shortly within this meeting. And then you are also mentioning the limited influence across the value chain. And yeah, that's exactly what this is about. It's a question that not one company can solve alone, but where joint action is needed. Okay. So these are exactly also the kind of questions we want to address in this masterclass. And since we already know we won't be able to answer every single question you might have due to time constraints, or maybe the questions are also going a bit deeper, we also want to offer you the possibility to continue the conversation with us, with our team at WifOR afterwards, and to specifically discuss your scope 3 needs. You will find a link to a calendar of my colleague in the chat, and you can book a meeting with her there directly. Okay, so let us get started with a quick keynote. I'm going to share my screen again. 1 second. Okay, yes. So the goal and challenge of current scope 3 actions is to move from universal challenges to joint actions across industries, and in today's case, across the pharmaceutical value chain. I'm going to give you a very quick intro. I guess most of you all know what falls under scope 3 actions, but just to have a bit of a start. So GHG emissions occur along the whole value chain, so from cradle to gate, but also from gate to grave. We have the upstream scope 3 emissions. Those are mostly in the supply chain, and they're mostly coming from purchases, but also leasing activities, waste or travel. We have own operation GHG emissions. Those are emissions either directly emitted by a company, which would be scope 1, or indirectly through purchases of energy, for example, scope 2. And then we also have downstream scope 3 emissions. Those emissions lie in the product value chain after leaving a factory. It could be, for example, the usage of sold products or the end-of-life treatment. And all of those emissions are categorized in the GHG protocol. There are guidelines in there and definitions of what belongs in which category. And when we just look at this graph, it already becomes apparent that probably most of a company's emissions might lie outside of its gates, but it doesn't mean this is outside of its responsibility. Therefore, collaboration is essential. And GHG emissions are a very significant driver of environmental externalities. And with the help of sector benchmarks, companies can identify such drivers and help prioritize actions. So when we look at this graph over here, we see the upstream and own operation environmental benchmarks for different industries. This benchmark is labeled in €1 monetized externality impact per €1 of turnover. And we can see that for the pharmaceutical as well as for the chemical industry, GHG is one of the most significant drivers of environmental externalities. When we now look at those GHG externalities or GHG emissions in a bit more detail in the two industries, we can see that those emissions mostly statistically occur between 2/3 or even 3/4 outside of a company's own door. So everything that's not on operation, but in the supply chain. And this is the case for chemical and pharmaceutical industry. And when we look even closer, we can see that like 1/4 for each statistically is occurring at a company's direct suppliers. So let's take a look at our practical example of Takeda and Evonik. So the value chains of Takeda and Evonik are staggered. So collaboration can help both to improve their Scope 3 reporting. So this graphic is supposed to show you how there are overlaps within the two value chains when we start, for example, from Takeda's perspective, which is the lower box. We have the upstream, own operation, and downstream emissions. Similar for Evonik, upstream, own operation, and downstream. And when we now start at this point, looking at Takeda, we can see that Takeda's tier 1 emissions, so the direct supplier emissions, lie within Evonik's own operation. Therefore, through collaboration, Evonik can provide Takeda with more accurate information on their own operations emissions, for example, but also beyond that with their Scope 3 emissions, like in form of product LCAs or like Evonik's own supplier engagement. So Evonik can actually enable Takeda to improve their tier 1 and partly also their tier 2 till end of the supply chain emission assessment. But this is not a one-way street. Takeda can also help Evonik to assess, for example, downstream impacts in categories like processing of sold goods, maybe, because Takeda's own operations lie within Evonik's downstream. And this is just an example to show you how suppliers and manufacturers are interlinked. I would like to take a quick look on how companies can even calculate their emissions and how the supplier collaboration can fit into it. So there are different methods that vary between different categories, companies, but mostly also data availabilities and applicability. When we look here at this is mostly for the upstream supply chain, we can distinguish between like supplier or product specific data and average data. Those methods are not mutually exclusive. One could start, for example, with a spend-based method that provides a good overview and is a statistically robust method in case of also limited data availability. But if supplier-specific data is publicly available in like sustainability reports or maybe supplier questionnaires were answered, this data can then replace the affected spend data. However, supplier data might be hard to retrieve, and it's basically impossible to get that from all suppliers. So it's very important to have supplier engagement strategies. And like this collaboration between Takeda and Evonik is a very great example of it. But where do I start? So how can one assess hotspots that can then lead to more focused further actions? GHG emissions can cluster in different markets, in different countries, in even different divisions within a company or suppliers. Here, for example, we have a spend-based scope-free assessment that shows us emissions, in this case here by sector. So we can see that supply chain materials are a big part, whereas there's not that many emissions lying probably in administrative activities. We can look at it by countries, and it's often the case that the countries you purchase the most from are not necessarily the countries where you have the highest emissions clustered. Or you can look at suppliers and by tiers. And with the help of like a first spend-based analysis, companies then have a tool to focus on further actions to the most relevant hotspots. And since it's almost impossible to expect every supplier, no matter the location, the size, or the country specific regulations, to be able to provide high quality emissions data, and those suppliers also depend on their suppliers to assess their scope 3, it is very important to have a selection of priority suppliers to then continue this journey of getting better emissions data. Okay, but a scope 3 assessment does not only help you or help companies to account for their environmental impacts, but it also provides a powerful lever to reduce those carbon footprints, but this might also be necessary because there's more national and international regulations these days regarding scope 3 emissions and other environmental impacts. And with one structured analysis, a company can not only support its decarbonization targets, but also comply with different regulatory requirements, for example, like the CSRD or the CBAM or the LKSG. Yes. So we have looked at typical scope 3 patterns across the pharmaceutical value chain and where the main hotspots might lie depending on your analysis, and also why a shared data foundation matters. And we have seen that a lot of issues can be tackled internally, but not all of them. So it is very important to use this lever of collaboration with suppliers, customers, peers, or maybe even with the regulators. So let's look at our practical example, which brings us to the second part of today's session. We will now focus on practical experiences and best practices from both sides of the value chain, the manufacturer's perspective and the supplier's perspective. So Jessica, Ranjan, thank you very much, both of you, again, to being here with us today. And let's start with the shared challenges you are currently facing. So my first question to you would be, what is the main scope 3 challenge you are currently prioritizing and why? Jessica, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all of that really useful background. So just to set the stage, Takeda has a commitment to reach net zero across all 3 scopes by 2040, and then a near-term science-based target to reduce our scope 3 emissions 25% by our fiscal year 2030. So with that in mind, we have been at it for some time in terms of advancing a scope 3 strategy. We've had a lot of progress within our procurement function to engage suppliers to set their own science-based targets and are starting to see some reductions from that. We also have a big focus on optimizing our distribution and logistics and a big push to shift from air to sea freight wherever possible in our distribution network. But at this stage, as we move from an enterprise, pretty high level roadmap where we've identified some of the major key initiatives that will get us closer to this net zero goal, we're really narrowing in on this near-term target of 25% by fiscal year 2030. And our main challenge is how we give very clear direction to all of our internal teams about the key initiatives at a function, business unit level that will move the needle. So we've taken what is a pretty high level enterprise roadmap, and over the course of the last year and into this year are translating that down into very tactical roadmaps to help individual parts of our business get to the 25%. And what does this look like? There's certainly a lot of areas that build upon our existing progress for supplier engagement, continuing to close the gaps and support suppliers who haven't yet set targets. and make sure we have the data in place so we can track that decarbonization journey for our suppliers. But we're also looking internally at what is within our own control, what we refer to internally as our business and design levers. So things like the air-to-sea conversion I mentioned, or using materials more efficiently, inventory management, some of these things that might also be best practice for other business reasons that can allow us to operate more efficiently, consider different materials, things that are in our control. So that's really what we're focused on right now, is these very tactical roadmaps at individual business units, and at the same time, making sure we're maturing our data systems so the specific projects that are being implemented can be captured in our Scope 3 accounting. So kind of moving forward with reduction initiatives while maturing the data system alongside.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting what you're saying, that it's not only about identifying of the initiatives, but like translating it into concrete actions. I picture this can be quite challenging. Ranjan, from your perspective at Evonik, what is your main Scope 3 challenge and what are you currently prioritizing?
Yeah, so Scope 3 for Evonik is one of the biggest carbon footprints that we have in the value chain. It's over 50% of our carbon footprint. And like Takeda, we also have targets and goals in place until 2030 to reduce our carbon footprints. For Scope 3, this is based on the Science Based Target Initiative, and we have committed to reducing this by 11% by 2030. So for Scope 3, one of the biggest challenges, and we saw this in the poll actually, is the availability of primary data of the raw materials, because upstream Scope 3 is the biggest carbon footprint. And we have a lot of problems. We started the supplier engagement program in Evonik a few years ago, and the uptake was really, really terrible. But we've noticed in the last few years that it's really coming on board as suppliers are becoming more and more aware of sustainability, how it impacts the final product. We are seeing a faster movement in their engagement. The primary data is still very important for us. It's still very, very difficult. And for the complex raw materials that we use in the pharma industry, it's very, very difficult to get some suppliers to give their data, or are they allowed to give the data, or they don't want to share it with us. So this is a big step that needs to be taken in order for us to work on Scope 3 topics.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'm hearing is there's some kind of a shared pattern, but like the main issue is data availability, but also engaging with your suppliers, getting your suppliers on board to also develop their own decarbonization strategies. And of course, pharmaceutical supply chains, you're dealing with like highly regulated materials. This can be an issue. Okay. So most companies, like you said, more or less know they need some kind of supplier engagement, but they also know they can't engage with everyone at once or to the same extent. So Jessica, how do you decide where to focus the supplier engagement, and how do you avoid spreading efforts across too many suppliers at the same time?
It's a great question. So at least at Takeda, and I think this is pretty common, while only 1% of our suppliers by count make up about 80% of our upstream Scope 3 emissions, right? So we have to look at the data and understand the relative significance of our suppliers. And while we might have kind of initiatives that are an expectation across our whole network, we really focus our engagement on those suppliers that are driving most of our footprint. We also make sure that we're integrating wherever possible the company's business strategy, right? So not just where are we today, but where are we going to be 5, 10 years from now? And how will the relative significance of different areas of our value chain change over the course of that time? Some of that comes from our financial forecasts. Some of that comes from partnering with procurement to really understand how we're managing our suppliers in a given category and what the future might hold. We're always looking for ways to gather data at scale and minimize the burden on our suppliers to address all of these one-off requests, right, for different kinds of data. So we've evaluated a number of different platforms to do that. I think that there are some promising options available now that can pull data from publicly available records and annual ESG reports and translate that into at least a good estimate of what your upstream emissions would be from a good portion of your upstream value chain, at least to kind of get an accurate view on your tier one. And then I would say lastly, we do try to leverage and participate actively in industry consortiums where we can kind of bring our needs on the Takeda side, but also amongst our peers and develop shared resources for our suppliers. We all are kind of sharing a portion of our value chains, right? Because they're so extensive. And so wherever we can partner with our peers to develop resources or support key initiatives together related to certain types of materials or regions where renewable energy can be expanded to some of our supply base, for example. We try to participate in those things like PSCI, the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, or Energize are two examples Takeda is actively involved in. And I also just wanted to build on something Ranjan said earlier about the challenge of those upstream raw material suppliers. That's a challenge for Takeda too. When we look at our upstream and the data that is more readily available versus not, a portion of our data, as your figure showed, is Evonik's data, right? So their scope 1 and 2 emissions that are relevant for our area of the business. That data is more easily available now, right? Because we have partners like Evonik and they control those emissions and those data. It's the further upstream, our tier 2 through N, where we have the same challenges as what Ranjan is mentioning. So I did just want to highlight that that's very much a shared challenge that we're thinking of.
Yes, thank you very much for that. That's a very powerful insight. It is true that often only a handful of suppliers represents the biggest share of emissions, but also, like you say, the further down the supply chain, the less control you have over it, but often a huge share of the emissions is situated in the supply chain. So partnering up at least might bring you one step further and towards like the shared goal of being able to better assess your emissions in your upstream supply chain. But staying on the topic of supplier engagement, do you have like a practical example how you improved the scope-free supplier process in the recent past?
Yeah, I think one thing even very recently that we've focused on, kind of in the spirit of simplification, is how can we really be concise and clear in what our expectations would be of our suppliers. And there's so many different ways to focus and build out your decarbonization journey. There's best practices. There are a lot of different resources out there. We're often not in a good position to give great attention to our suppliers on how they decarbonize, right? They know their business, they know their suppliers. And so we've simplified some of our asks in terms of, what we bring into negotiations with suppliers and the expectations we set to really focus in on setting targets and demonstrating progress via public disclosures, ideally, right? Again, minimizing the burden of one-off data collection with our suppliers. So we're leaving it more up to our suppliers to say, what is the best way for them to get to those goals? We don't necessarily need to track that or dictate any of that, right? But also be available and make sure that when there are challenges, we are getting that awareness so we can look to some of these industry consortiums we're in or some of these other areas we're working in to say, is there anything we're involved with that we could bring to a supplier who sees a bottleneck or a challenge, to invite them to kind of collaborate or benefit from some of these resources. So I think we're really trying to be simple in what the asks are and like outcome driven in how we have these discussions with suppliers, as opposed to, being in a position where we're giving a laundry list of initiatives that they should be implementing internally. They know their business better than we do, and we're really here to support when there are challenges that we might be able to, again, rely on some other resources to help unlock.
I think that's a great example. Like it probably does not make sense from an outsider perspective to like prescribe a supplier how exactly they should decarbonize. But yeah, we have to focus on the outcomes. And at the same time, you're not only telling them what to do, setting expectations, but you also try to enable them to progress through this, like with resources and support. But from the supplier perspective, Ranjan, what is one example where you were able to improve transparency and reduce emissions, and what were the key enablers that made this progress possible?
Yeah, so it's always very difficult as a supplier sometimes to reduce our carbon footprints because, of course, the products we make for our customers are highly regulated and changes are not very easily available. But we do try and use wherever possible. An example I can give you is to use the principles of green chemistry that we try and incorporate into our manufacturing processes wherever possible. And here, one of the principles of green chemistry is to use catalysts that will enable us to improve or give an alternative route to a synthetic process, or to make the route a little bit quicker, saving energy, for example. So that is something that we really are looking at, especially in our CDMO business. The other part of that related to that is that we all know that precious catalysts have a very, very big carbon footprint. They're used in very, very small amounts, but because of the carbon footprint due to the mining and extraction and purification, etc., have a very, very big carbon footprint. So what we were able to do in our process to reduce emissions was to try and recycle and reuse this precious metal catalyst that we were using, and now we have been able to reduce the carbon footprint of an API without changing too many things, without changing any of the raw materials or the process it was made, but simply by recycling, reusing the catalyst, able to reduce the carbon footprint of the products. That enables our customer then to have some of the benefits as well. So that's one example where we were able to do that. And as we know, the carbon footprints of APIs can be very, very high. It can be in the thousands as well. So it's very nice to hear from Jessica that you understand where suppliers are coming from. You're trying to help us, to help you move forward to try and reduce the environmental impact, basically, of what we can do together. So that's one example that I can share with you.
And I think building on what Ranjan said, especially in our industry where it's highly regulated, and given the fact that, a lot of our manufacturing is internal, but we also rely on a lot of external partners for manufacturing, as well as for key starting materials. There's very little that our suppliers can change without a strong partnership with Takeda to redesign a process, bring it through all of the filings and regulatory and quality steps required. So that it's a very, very strong collaboration, and really can't be done any other way to make those kinds of changes. And so I think it's a really good point, and something that is pretty unique to our industry, I would say, because there's a lot that, it just simply can't be changed without kind of a full, intense collaboration to do so.
Exactly.
Well, thank you to both of you. That already brings me to my next question, which would be like, we talked about what individual companies can do and also demand from their suppliers. But like you say, many of those issues clearly go beyond one organization. So maybe we can talk a bit more about where you see the clearest need for collaboration across the value chain, meaning the areas that neither side can solve effectively on its own. Maybe Jessica, you would like to continue on that?
Sure. And I know we're talking a lot about the upstream in this conversation, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think about collaboration for some of our downstream emissions, which are part of Evonik's downstream to some extent too. So when we look across our value chain, there are certain areas that we refer to internally as hard to abate, areas where there just aren't solutions today that exist in order to decarbonize that area. A really good example of this for us is the disposal of Takeda's product packaging after a medication is administered. So especially in healthcare settings, like in hospitals, our product packaging ends up in these highly regulated medical waste streams that are being incinerated and are really emission-intensive disposal process. It's not unique to Takeda. It's really a big challenge across the healthcare industry when it comes to decarbonization. And so we identified this as a big challenge and knew it was not something that we would be able to solve on our own. We were very fortunate, actually, at Climate Week in New York a couple of years ago, to interact with Boston Medical Center, which is a healthcare institution located in Boston that has had a really strong focus on environmental sustainability as well as environmental justice and health equity. A very amazing organization. You should look them up if you're not aware. We came together in what was a very unprecedented collaboration for both organizations, and I won't make it seem like it was easy, because it wasn't easy for a pharmaceutical company and a healthcare entity to build a collaboration to focus on decarbonizing waste streams. But because of the shared values of our organizations and focus on these environmental goals, because patient health is also very much driven by environmental health, we were able to build a partnership where BMC is innovating and looking for ways over a 3-year collaboration to decarbonize the disposal of their regulated medical waste. So we're supporting them with subject matter expertise and doing waste audits and helping to identify solutions. And after the first year of this collaboration, we even have solutions already that will start pilot testing, where they think about 20% of the emissions can be addressed. The goal is, of course, not for Boston Medical Center to do this work and then to call it a day, but really for Takeda to help promote and elevate the good work happening at BMC and expand this across the healthcare ecosystem by leveraging these best practices and showing that it's possible. And so this is something that I think when we look for collaborations, often it's kind of unprecedented. It's partnerships that are surprising oftentimes, because, why would we be working together on something like this? But often that's where I think the most innovation can happen. And if we can prove that it's possible, then there's opportunities to scale.
Well, that's great. It's very interesting. So it really is about the whole system and landscape coming together and push this change instead of just individual steps in companies. Ranjan, how would you see this from your side, from your perspective?
Yeah, so from a collaboration point of view, it obviously involves the whole value chain. It's not just one aspect of it, it's the whole value chain. So we would like to collaborate more with our suppliers, but there are aspects of the value chain where we have absolutely no influence, and we've mentioned regulatory constraints. And here I think the regulatory bodies can play a bigger role in helping us to try and change and enable us to change raw materials where greener alternatives are available, or to give us indications that it allows us to change something. For example, if we identify a greener alternative, we know that this could lead to not only lab trials, pilot trials, but stability trials, and the whole trials that could lead up to, which means that not only does it cost a lot of money in terms of money, but also in time. And at the moment, we don't have that time. We don't have time to reevaluate a drug with alternative raw materials if regulatory constraints are in place. So I think the regulatory bodies can here play a big role for us. but also for a supplier like Evonik to the pharmaceutical industry, we really need our customers to help us understand what's happening with our product. Evonik's raw material is only one part of the jigsaw of the bigger picture. And sometimes we don't know how our products are being used by our customers. And if we could understand that a little bit more, if there was a bit more collaboration, a little bit more openness, we can then start to modify or produce products in the future that enable the downstream scope 3 emissions that could help our customers address those. So, for example, with the increased biodegradability of the product, could also help our customers. But we really need this collaboration from the pharma industry to really tell us how is our product being used, and how can we help them to reach their goals, basically. And it's very nice to hear that Jessica was talking about the downstream side, because I think for us, this is, for Evonik, it's out of our control. However, with our RD&I and our next generation solutions, what we're looking to do is to have products that are already in the market with a sustainability aspect to them. So maybe they are more fermentation based or biodegradable, etc. More greener alternatives are in place there. So yeah, I think collaboration is key. One of the things that I think also that we could all collaborate with, regardless of what industry you're in, is if you have, if you come across a customer or a supplier that could benefit your customer or your supplier, please promote that customer. Because, for instance, with Takeda, we recently talked about a waste disposal company that could help with avoiding incineration. So if we could share this type of data and try and promote sharing of information, I think this is a very good collaboration where there's nothing for us to gain from promoting this customer or initiative, but at least it helps the industry overall. So I think collaboration is really, really important here.
Right. And even to bring it full circle, that example Ranjan's mentioning, we brought to BMC and said, hey, could this be one of the things that could address the disposal emissions very far downstream? And similar to what you were saying, how the inputs often dictate what the emissions will be in those downstream elements. So in the Boston Medical Center in collaboration, we're getting some of the primary packaging suppliers for our products involved to understand what does the future of those materials look like? Will that make it easier or harder to implement certain solutions? And same with, when we look at the air to sea conversion, the stability of the product and the temperature it needs to be held at, and all of those factors, which are driven by the raw materials used and the formulation of the product, impact whether we can, shift to a lower mode of transportation that might take a little bit longer, right? So it's all very connected, I think, as Ranjan mentioned. And so the more we can kind of share best practices and think about it from a systems perspective, the stronger solutions that we'll be able to find.
Well, thank you very much, you two. I would really like to continue this discussion, and there's many more questions I would have, but for the sake of time, I would maybe ask you to give maybe 1-2 practical takeaways you would like to share with today's audience, like some closing points, something they can maybe apply when working on scope 3 across pharmaceutical value chains. Maybe Jessica, you would like to start?
Sure. There's 2 things that come to mind in terms of practical takeaways. I think one is, because scope 3 is just such a big problem, you can get into a situation where you're so focused on the data that you struggle to make progress, right? And so I think finding this balance of leveraging data for direction and then taking action before you have perfect information, and then kind of oscillating between the two. Look for the direction. Where are the hotspots? Where will you know you're directionally moving in the right to the right place in terms of reducing your emissions? Which hotspots, which levers, And then as you start implementing, use that to mature your data system so you can track that progress and then kind of keep going back and forth. So I think it's kind of an art and a science, to be honest, in terms of advancing your strategy while maturing your data systems at the same time. I think the second thing, which I mentioned earlier, is don't be afraid to work with unlikely partners, regardless of kind of which sector or industry you're in. Your scope 3 emissions are just a subset of the economy. We have every sector pretty much represented somewhere in our upstream value chain. And so if it's outside of your industry, it still could be a hotspot or an area. And don't be afraid to learn from other industries, right? Because a lot goes all the way back to the basic chemical building blocks, right? So how retail or food or CPG has started to address these problems might be relevant in some instances for our industry and vice versa. So look for unlikely partners, because there's probably a lot that we can learn and more that can be collaborated on, I think, broadly across industries.
Thank you very much, Ranjan. What would be your key takeaway message for today?
I think my key takeaway message would be that collaboration is key. I think we've talked about that. We'd like our customers and our suppliers to be a little bit more open with us and how we can actually work together, be a bit more transparent, whether that's under an NDA or whatever it takes. We should actually work together to get to that situation. But the other one is also look, as Jessica was saying, where are the hotspots? What's under your influence? What can you work with without having to change too many things? And in Evonik, one of the things that we will be concentrating on this year is how to reduce scope 3 emissions in our waste streams, how to reduce that waste, how can we get rid of that waste with a lower carbon footprint rather than send it to landfill. Can we recycle it, reuse it? Can we sell it to another industry that's less critical, that can reuse it? So look for things that can be done. Look for the hotspots, and just work together. I think that's the most important thing I think I would like to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of you. Strong closing messages. It really stands out to me also that the progress in this field does depend on multiple things, but two things coming together: improving transparency over time, while already taking action where possible. Like you say, Jessica, don't be scared to work with unlikely partners. With that, I'd like to open the discussion to the audience. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask the question live. It would also be great if you can let us know who the question is addressed to. And yeah, we try to get through as many questions as possible, but I mean, we don't have that much time left. So if we can't answer every question today, like I said before, you're very, very welcome to reach out to us afterwards, and we would be happy to continue the conversation. Okay. So I can see one question for now in the Q&A. I've never used that tool, so let's see how it works. We already have one question regarding the waste management. I will just read it out, and then maybe Jessica or Ranjan, depending on who would like to go first or who would like to answer. I think waste was more of your topic, Ranjan. You can then answer. So Jessica Vieira is writing, she heard that this challenge of waste from the medtech industry, and she sees that there's a willingness there, but the execution is a challenge. For example, finding workforce to clean medical waste, because it's not like can be a dirty job, so it can be brought back into the cycle. Do you have like any solution idea or something in place to overcome issues like this? Is this something you think about while talking about your own waste reduction challenges?
I think that's more from the downstream side. I don't know, Jessica, if you have any more thoughts on that. For us, we're mainly dealing with the production waste and how to try and eliminate that and how to reduce that waste. we don't have things like the too much of the medical waste related. So I don't know, Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that waste topic?
Sure. Yeah, and I think similar. We have both ends, right? We have the industrial waste and looking at opportunities for solvent recovery and things like that to reduce those waste streams in our internal sites. But then we also, in our downstream, like in the example with our Boston Medical Center collaboration, but also through Takeda's BioLife centers, which are plasma collection centers for our plasma-derived therapies business unit. We also deal with some of the waste streams that are similar to what you'll see in clinical settings. I think there's a lot that the team is doing to look for innovative ways to manage that waste. So there are advanced recycling processes that are being evaluated. There's a sanitization step that also has to be included. The challenge often comes from the type of plastics being used, and whether there are recycling options. So I think we're very much in the kind of pilot testing, looking at advanced options stage, and also one of the biggest challenges, and I know we have team members on the call who are from that area of business, so maybe they can jump in the chat, but is the highly fragmented nature of these waste streams. So, in order to have kind of a collection that could manage all of that in a way that is cost effective is a challenge. So approaching it from a consortium standpoint and looking not just at a Boston Medical Center, but looking across the healthcare institutions in Boston, and can you set up a system that could collect from all of them to implement an advanced recycling technology is, I think, a direction that we're trying to help explore. It's a big part of why this collaboration includes a lot of engagement with external stakeholders to figure out ways that the system can adopt a solution, not just kind of one actor. So those are just some examples of how we're thinking about it. I don't think we have a silver bullet at this point, but as I mentioned with BMC, we're going to start pilot testing some of the different options in the next year, 1 to 2 years. We also have a report from the Boston Medical Center collaboration that's coming out, or that has just come out. We can maybe throw it in the chat to see what we've learned there.
Thank you. There's another question which is more of a it's not as detailed, but I think it's very important. The question is, are scope-free data, is scope-free data used already in procurement processes, or are there plans to do so? You mentioned you have some colleagues from procurement here, but maybe you also know, you two also do know, do know how procurement, if there's a link between those two departments, or if you're only going to procurement to ask for their data.
Maybe I can go first here. In Evonik, we do have a separate procurement sustainability department that is involved in this sustainability supplier engagement, and they are not only talking to the suppliers but also collecting all the data and trying to help suppliers who don't have data on how to calculate it and collect their data. Where necessary, we try and help them by offering to conduct the life cycle assessment for their data, but this is not something that is for everybody, as you can imagine. I mean, Evonik is a big company. We have a lot of raw materials, but we do have procurement specialists who are collecting this data on the carbon footprint. We also have a database where we are looking for future, when suppliers are coming to us and saying that in the future, and maybe in 5 years' time, we will have a new plant that will be developing bio-based solvents that will be on stream then in that time frame. And so we keep tracks on them. It's a tracking tool. It's keeping in touch with the suppliers. It's something that we actually are working very hard on for our future raw material database.
And I'll just elaborate on the Takeda side. We have a very strong collaboration with our procurement function, and as I mentioned, engaging suppliers to set science-based targets and setting an expectation of publishing the progress against those targets has been, I think, part of our story for some time. I think our team really, I think, supports the procurement function to provide direction based on the data on where we might want to focus, and helps with external collaborations that can provide resources, things like, if we're aware of renewable energy cohorts or VPPA cohorts, where we can invite suppliers to participate if that's going to be a part of their journey, and things like that. I think the data largely informs which suppliers we're focusing on, and what the different opportunities and asks might be. We're trying to avoid asking for data on one-off requests, though, as I mentioned. So it's informing the strategy, but we're really exploring scalable ways to collect that data, to minimize kind of the burden and the ad hoc nature of the data collection.
Thank you. Maybe one last question. It is because of Ranjan's earlier point around the challenge to even get her suppliers to give her data. And Ranjan, what do you think could change the dynamics here? And then also maybe everyone here can write it in the chat if they have their own they have their own ideas about it. What could be incentives that would work so suppliers are also more willing to engage?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing, as I said earlier at the beginning, we are seeing more engagement from suppliers to provide us with primary data, because they're understanding a little bit more about the sustainability topics and why it's important to us. We are also talking to our suppliers and asking them what are the challenges that they are having in not being able to reduce their carbon footprint of the raw materials that they supply to us, and sometimes it's a regional thing as well. We know regionally, globally, it's not always possible to get green energy or green electricity to reduce it, because this is the low hanging fruit. If our suppliers can move to green energy, this will obviously reduce the carbon footprint of the product they supply to us. I think trying to understand where our suppliers are in their sustainability journey helps us a lot, because then if they are a crucial key supplier, we can work with them and help them. There are initiatives that we can use to help them move to a greener and more sustainable way of production. But there are also a lot of tools available now where they can help themselves to try and estimate their carbon footprints. These tools are from various different agencies, but they also help. And within the chemical industry, we are part of Together for Sustainability, where we have a group of companies, a lot of companies together, and we're using something called the Sea Green platform, where we are now sharing carbon footprint data between all the chemical companies and our customers and suppliers. And this is really helping us actually to improve our data. And we can see a big improvement over the last 2-3 years.
I wanted to quickly, before we close, also address Roger's earlier question in the chat about kind of willingness to pay and the demand signal. I think you're acknowledging a very big challenge, not unique to our industry, but across, I mentioned the chemical building blocks are, supporting every industry, right? And the capital investments that it will take to convert assets globally is pretty massive, right? And so this is a challenge for sure. I think one of the things you mentioned about the mass balance approach and some of the market-based mechanisms to connect the downstream demand signal. So like where Takeda sits pretty far down the value chain up to the tier N supplier, I think will need to be part of that solution. How things get finalized in the SBTi standard revisions, I think will set a course for how that can and can't be done. So we're expecting that later this year for the scope 3 portion of the updated SBTi standard. But we've already seen and heard from some companies and startups that are working on these kinds of schemes that scheme in a good way, can have negative perceptions, but where you can really connect using a market-based mechanism, the decarbonization to, the cost of making those large investments upstream, similar to what we've seen with like the RSPO for incentivizing sustainable palm oil plantation management, right? So I think there are some opportunities there, but you're acknowledging a very key challenge, right? That the demand is often very far down the value chain and disconnected from like where the investment is needed very far upstream to address some of those big hotspots. So I just wanted to acknowledge that because I know there's been a lot of chatter about that. And I think once we have some guidance from the SBTI standard revision on what market-based mechanisms can be used for Scope 3, some of that might be able to get kickstarted, is how we're thinking about it.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. But thank you so much, Jessica and Ranjan, for like sharing your practical but also honest insights from your work. I would very quickly summarize the main points of today. So we have learned that Scope 3 is not only a reporting challenge, but also a collaboration challenge. With average data or spend-based methods, you can already have like a strong starting point. From there on, you can go along, identify hotspots, set priorities, and engage with the right suppliers. But prioritization is very important. Companies cannot work with every supplier on every issue at once. And collaboration across the value chain is essential when it comes to transparency. There are regulatory constraints and technical feasibility limits. Individual actors can just not solve by themselves. And then finally, one message from like both industry perspectives today is that practical progress starts with openness, with structure, and with a shared understanding. So with a good data foundation, if you focus on the right hotspots and build more on collaboration, you're on a good way. I mean, we're already a bit over time, but like for the people who are still here, maybe we can do a very quick poll, and then I will leave you off into your, depending on which time zone you are, into your, as we would say in German, Feierabend. Okay. And if you have further questions we weren't able to answer today, of course, you can reach out to my colleague Katrin. She has posted her calendar invite and her email in the chat. And I also saw that, Jessica, you have posted some links that can be very interesting for people to see. Unfortunately, we don't have time to look at this today. So I would like to quickly get your inputs on what would you use as a structured Scope 3 assessment in your organization as of now? Again, you can scan it on your phone, or you can use the link. And this is an open question, so you can just type in what comes to your mind as a closing point of today's session. Okay. Okay. I can see 2 people are typing. Okay, it seems like strategy is the most important, or like the most prominent point that comes to mind when we are thinking about what would use, and that's exactly what we've discussed today. You need a good strategy. It can have different starting points, but in the end, it is very helpful to think about how you can tackle different problems that occur when you're doing a Scope 3 assessment. They can be of very different nature, but with like a solid strategy that involves different levers, like engagement of suppliers or different calculation methods. You can then use Scope 3 assessment for not only regulatory aspects or to reduce your impacts or costs or even prices, but also to lead your business and adapt your business strategy in a way that all brings us forward from an environmental but also social point of view. So that would be it from our side today. Thank you very much again to Jessica and Ranjan for taking the time and for like the joint cooperation before. It was very nice to organize this webinar with you. I was very happy to be able to set this up. And thanks to everyone for joining today and also for your active participation. We really appreciated your time and your engagement, and you will receive the recording and the key takeaways after the session. And yeah, we'd be happy to continue the conversation with you, whether it be it around supplier engagement, prioritization, benchmarks, or strategic action. So I hope to see you at a future session maybe. Yeah, thank you very much, and goodbye.